All right, guys, welcome. Week 2 recap of the Royal Fantasy Football League. Jumping right into it, just like last week, we're going to start with the largest margin of victory and working our way down into the smallest. So first off, we've got the hometown Hotties who beat the Bend It Like Bridgewater. Still an inflammatory name. Don't know why that has to be your name. It's hurtful, but we're moving on. 153 to 110. Good game all around here. Really liked what I saw from both teams, but starting out with Dan, he's really coming out strong. I thought he was really impressive the past 2 weeks. First week he scored 155 points. This week scored 153. That consistency is absolutely fantastic. I know that Dan's really excited about that. And it's a really unique difference, I think, in the first week to the second week in terms of how he scored that volume of points. You look at his first week, and it was really due to some big games from Drew Brees and A.J. Green. But now in the second week, there's a lot more consistency there, and it speaks volumes to the type of team Juanis has built there. But he got 20 points from Delaney Walker, 23 from his defense, 29 from Andre Hopkins, and 35 from Matt Forte. So there wasn't just two huge games like he had last week. A lot more consistency, a lot more better scoring overall. And I know personally that he's very excited about the emergence of Matt Forte. I know Dan owns him in at least 2 of the leagues he's in. And Forte's had 2 great games and is really solidifying himself as a top-tier running back. He's ranked 2nd right now in our fantasy football league. First week he scored 19 points, and this week, after a 100-yard on the rushing and a 3-touchdown day, he had scored 35 points, which was Dan's highest score. And I know Dan's really excited about that, and it's a very good game from the New York Jet running back. On the other side of this game, Tennell, had a pretty good game, and 110 points is nothing to be super angry about. I mean, granted, it's a loss, and no one likes to lose, but 110 points is still fairly respectable, and nothing to be ashamed about. And this week, I think he had some really strong running back play. You look at David Johnson scoring 16 points and DeMarco Murray scoring 20. Those are the types of the production you want from those guys consistently week in and week out. Tough part for Tennell this week was Carlos Hyde, his savior last week, only scoring 5 points against a tough Carolina defense, and his wide receivers, who, man, didn't have great games. Justin Jeffrey had 14 points, which is about average, I would say. I think out of a wide receiver one, you're hoping for more production. Emmanuel Sanders only had 6 points, and the rest of his team didn't do great. I guess you could count Graham Gano getting him 18 points, which is just crazy for a kicker. But that's a tough way to kind of have your second week of the season start out with weak wide receiver play. And unfortunately for him, his wide receivers aren't going to be a whole lot greater, especially with Jay Cutler going down to a sprained thumb, I think it was. We don't know how long he's going to be out. They say he's day-to-day, but might not be ready back for this third week, which means Alshon Jeffrey's production is going to be up in the air. He's still an elite wide receiver, but I think it's going to be tougher to count on him week in and week out for production. The one thing Tennell's got going for him is that I think he's got one of the deeper teams in the league. He had 85 points on his bench this week, which bodes well for him moving forward, especially as we get into some of the bye weeks when you've got to start subbing in players. Michael Crabtree had 13 this week. He had LaShawn McCoy, Alan Hearns on his bench, and Sterling Shepard, the slot wide receiver for the New York Giants, who had 24 this week. So he's got players that he can plug in and recover from, but yeah, it just didn't happen for him this week. Moving into the second game with the second largest margin of victory is my game. Puginators versus Minia had 112 points versus 79. Starting with my team first, again, 112 points. Obviously hoping for more, but not something that I can complain too much about. And I was fairly happy with some of my production from my wide receivers. I was fairly consistent across the board, with the exception of Jeremy Langford. That's what it is, and hopefully, that's kind of the end of me relying on Langford. Jamal Charles is coming back in week 3, and I don't know where he'll be at, but a lot of his training staff thought that he could have played week 2, but they just wanted to play it safe, give him another week of rest. So hopefully he can come out in week 3 and be pretty strong. So hopefully that's kind of the end of me having to start Jeremy Langford. But we'll kind of see how the season goes. I benched Des Bryant this week, who scored 22 points on my bench. That's my one biggest critique I have on my team. But at the end of the day, I'm more happy that he had the game and that he's developing that rapport with Dak Prescott that we saw in the preseason. I'm happy for that moving forward. I hope it continues. Moving on to Minia's team, man. I mean, if we're gonna give the most unlucky team award to anybody 2 weeks into the season, it's definitely Minia. I think he's had a really rough stretch, and you kind of feel for him. He's first in the league in points against, which is 296. So almost averaging 150 points against, which is just a brutal way to start out the year. And you look at some of the production of his team, and it's just uncommon. Look at his running backs: Todd Gurley, Devonta Freeman, Mark Ingram. Todd Gurley and Devonta Freeman are both top 5 running backs. At least they were projected to be in the preseason, and Mark Ingram was at least a top 15, top 20, worst case scenario. But they just have not produced. Gurley got you 7 this week, Freeman 9, Ingram 8, and you're in a really, really tough position there because you can't bench them. You can't. I mean, those are solid producers who should be at RB1 levels, both of them for Freeman and Gurley, and Ingram should probably be at an RB2, but you've got him at the flex. You don't know what they're going to do, and they should be producing more, but on the odd chance that you bench them, kind of like with me and Des Bryant this week, then that's when they're going to score, and you're just going to end up missing out. So those are guys that you can't really change, barring injury or anything like that, and so you just kind of have to ride out the waves and hope that they come out on top. On your wide receivers, 2 didn't have a whole lot of luck. Jordy Nelson had 18, and that was some terrific production from him, I think, especially his first game back, I think, back to what we expect Jordy Nelson to be. And you had a lot of production from him on his bench, but I was kind of looking at some of the projections from this past week, and you benched Eric Decker, scored you 29 points, and that's a guy I could see starting in place of Doug Baldwin, who scored you 5 this week. But truthfully, man, I don't know if I would have done anything different. Baldwin's the wide receiver 1 on a good offense, who was coming off a 24-point game last week. And so I think you start him, and I think it's just unlucky that he only had 5 points and came down with an injury. And you look on his bench, he had 125 points on his bench from some terrific production from some of his wide receivers. But, man, Marvin Jones, who's an up-and-coming guy, scored 24 points, and Mike Wallace scored 20. But all of those guys, man, I'm not starting them over Nelson and Baldwin on a consistent basis, and I'd have to have a lot of reasoning, a really tough matchup for Nelson or Baldwin, and a really great matchup for Jones or Wallace to really start them over those guys. And that's just a tough play. And Wallace's, I think, has been really surprising. He scored 19 points the first game, 20 points in the second game. So he's been pretty consistent and might actually be warranting starting material with Decker and Jones. But I'm not sure if I start anyone different. That's just a tough kind of week for Minia's team, and I hope he rebounds. I think he will. I think he'll turn out all right. Moving on to the third game of the week, Copsing versus Shack Tack, which was a really, really close game. I mean, this wasn't the game that had the closest margin of victory, but was certainly very, very impressive and could have been very, very close. Copsing had 152 points. Burka had 137. Taking a look at Copsing's team first, you've got good, respectable scores really across the board, with the exception of his defense. He had the Bengals defense going up against Pittsburgh and Rashad Jennings, the New York Giants running back. he had some great scores, really. 18 from Stafford, 23 from Blunt, 20 from Fitzgerald, 26 from Julio, 19 from Evans, and 28 from Greg Olsen. That was a great game from him. And that's again similar to the hometown hotties. That's the consistent production that you really, really love to see. And that's a strong, really strong, balanced team that I'm not looking forward to facing in the near future. Even taking a look at his bench, he had Kelvin Benjamin on his bench scoring 34, and so he's got another wide receiver that he could plug in. Even though I'm not sure if you'd start him over Jones, Evans, and Fitzgerald, which are terrific wide receivers who are really scoring consistently this year. But man, he's got some great wide receiver depth there that it's important to acknowledge. And what scares me, truthfully, about Copsing's team is, look out. We'll dodge a bullet in week 3 here against Copsing, but Le'Veon Bell, riding his bench, comes back week 4, and he's going to fill that slot that he's got right now for Jennings, and you know that he's going to be a very, very dangerous team moving forward. So I'm not looking forward to going up against Copsing anytime soon. Moving on to Shack Attack, Burka's team. I think he's up there with Minia in terms of just unlucky plays. Not necessarily in player performance, but just in terms of who he's going up against. He's ranked 3rd in points against with 285. And he's got good, respectable scores every week. 129 the first week, 137 this week. And if you look at this week, he beats every single person in the league except for Copsing and the hometown hotties. And we're going to need a nickname for that type of trophy or that type of award, because it's going to happen just about every week where one guy scores, 2nd, 3rd most in the league, but just loses due to some unlucky. It's just bad luck. And he had some great production from some of his running backs, and Brandon Marshall, his wide receiver, scored on 21. The tough part about this, and I don't know how Burke is feeling about it, but I think it's got to have somewhat of a bitter taste in his mouth. Chooses to bench Stephon Diggs, whom I think, as we all know, had a great game on Sunday night. I swear I won't go and I won't talk smack about the Packers-Vikings game. Terrific game, I think, on both sides. I think a classic for both teams. I loved watching that game, but understandable that Burka, as a diehard Packers fan, not going to start Diggs. I don't blame him for that. If I had, Jordy Nelson on that team, I'm not sure I'd start him against the Vikings, just because I think that creates too much of an inner conflict. And as a general rule, I avoid Packers players specifically for that reason. But it's what cost it. Look at Michael Floyd, only scored him 8 points, who I think had a good matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Cardinals offense, obviously terrific, and they scored 40 points. The Cardinals scored 40 points in that game, but Michael Floyd just didn't give up a significant chunk of that production. And that's a tough pill to swallow. He started Gronk this week, who was again out with a hamstring injury, I believe. That's just a tough plug and play. He had Witten on his bench, who scored him 8, but that's going to get you closer, but it's not going to get you all the way there to kind of tying Copsing's points. So just a tough matchup. Melvin Gordon was on your bench, scored 25 points, who doubled his projective. But similar to Minia, you could have plugged him in the flex, could have replaced him for Elliott, but Elliott and Macklin, even looking at projections, matchups, had the better play. And I don't think, you kind of regret not starting him because he scores a lot of points, but you also couldn't have foreseen, Gorvin pulling that type of a game off. So, you roll away next week, come back strong. Burke has still got a really, really solid team.